So this is actually a paper I'm giving next week in Romania, in Bucharest, except I'm going to have to give it in 30 minutes. So there'll be, you're actually going to hear much closer to the full version. I'm giving you maybe 2/3 of the paper as written, where they're going to get about 1/3. So anyway, so I look forward to your comments. I was just explaining earlier, the ink is just drying. This paper I've just written in the last few weeks, and so any feedback, comments, or anything like that would be most welcome. It's very much work in progress. Okay, so let's get going. Method and the improvement of the mind in 18th century logic. How should we think about the place of method in 18th century logic texts? Is there anything philosophically substantive to glean from the various methods that were almost standard as the fourth part of a logic text? And in particular, what benefits or improvements to the mind did 18th century logicians believe the practice of method would bring to their readers? When we look back at part 4 of the Port Royal logic of 1662, we can see how it had emerged as a kind of Cartesio-Pascalian response to the traditional logic textbooks of the schools. Yet when we look forward to John Stuart Mill's A System of Logic from 1843, we find a completely different and new conception of method. Mill's methods that remain under discussion in the philosophy of science today. But what of all the treatments of method in the 18th century? What are their origins, their inspiration, their philosophical significance? And why was this approach to method completely abandoned in the century that followed? Now, I hope in this paper to answer or offer answers to some of these questions. Some of the answers will be tentative, some of them will be firmly rooted in the texts under consideration. The answers offered here are predicated on a historiography of late early modern logic that draws on related work that I've done on the theory of principles, and in particular, the role of principles in the acquisition of knowledge. So this paper begins with a historiographical framing of method in early modern logic, and then it proceeds to a comparative analysis of 4 methods, one Swiss, one English, one Scottish, and one French. And we've got the 4 logics there on the slide. So let's get the historiographical framework set up. What was the rationale for including a 4th part on method in a logic textbook? So I'm going to offer here a historiography of early modern logic, which goes some way to explaining this phenomenon. Almost all early modern philosophers were committed to the view that scientific knowledge, what's often called scientia, using the Latin term, is demonstrated from principles that are certain. They had theories about what constitutes a principle and how principles are to be discovered. That is, they had theories of principles. In this belief about scientific knowledge, what Locke called knowledge scientifical, they were following Aristotle's posterior analytics. In addition, they believed that the contents or constituents of a science are those theorems or propositions that are demonstrated from the principles. In order to acquire the contents of a science, one needed a theory of demonstration. And here, for almost all early modern philosophers, Aristotle's syllogistic provided that theory. It was an account of valid and invalid argument forms. And to be sure, there were critics of the syllogistic, including Descartes and Locke, Bacon. However, this was the exception rather than the rule. Once one has the theorems that have been demonstrated from the principles, one then needs to construct the science. Otherwise, there's just an unordered heap of theorems or propositions that has no shape. And it's this ordering and shaping of the theorems demonstrated from the principles that's the subject of the 4th part of early modern logics. That is, the part on method. So we've got the theory of principles, the theory of demonstration, and a theory of the sciences, or at least a method for constructing a science. And this package is what I call the Neo-Aristotelian theory of knowledge acquisition, or NATCA for short, rather ugly acronym. Now, it's important to be clear that not all disciplines qualify as sciences. In fact, there's an important contrast class to the sciences derived from principles. That class is the arts. The science-art distinction falls out of NATCA. The arts are just those disciplines in which the rules, methods, and products are not demonstrated from principles. Now, there's much debate about the nature of the arts in the 18th century, which saw the emergence of a new category, namely the fine arts, and that was first proposed by Charles Batteux in 1748. The important point for us, however, is that there's an ongoing debate as to whether or not logic is an art or a science. On this question, our four logicians side with Arnaud and Nicole and regard it as an art, not a science. All logicians were agreed, however, that there was one science that genuinely lived up to the ideals of NATCA, and that science is geometry. So let me just catch up with the slides. I'm sort of running ahead of myself here. Go back one. In the early modern period, geometry became either an ideal that other sciences should aspire to, such as Spinoza's Ethics, for example, which is written according to the More Geometrico, or in some extreme cases, like that of Hobbes, it was believed that there are only one or two sciences, perhaps just geometry, or in Hobbes' case, there's just geometry and civil philosophy. There's Hobbes' geometry, where he reckons he sorted out the correct axioms, with all due respect to Euclid. And then there's the Leviathan. They're the only two sciences that are possible. For Hobbes, there are just two sciences. For most early moderns, there are many sciences, but the paradigm science, if you want to call it that, is geometry. And I follow Alan Chalmers in calling this focus on geometry as the exemplar science. I call it the Euclidean ideal. In addition to the Euclidean ideal, there's another theory that goes hand in hand with NATCA. And this is the classical theory of concepts, what is sometimes called the containment theory. This is the view that concepts that can be defined have constituents that together form the necessary and sufficient conditions for the application of that concept. Therefore, something like bachelor is going to contain unmarried, adult, and male. If you want to use it correctly, you've got to know what the constituents of the concept are. Just give you an example of this from Isaac Watts. Watts says this: whatsoever is evidently contained in the idea of anything may be affirmed of that thing with certainty. Reason is contained in the idea of a man. We may affirm man is reasonable. Now, I claim that the sections on method in the Port Royal logic and in our four 18th century texts under consideration here only make sense in the light of NATCA and the containment theory of concepts. So in a moment, we're going to examine the four parts on method of our four logics and see how they arise and can be explained, arise from and can be explained by NATCA. However, by the 18th century, other doctrines and approaches were available to be incorporated into logical theory. It's not as if NATCA explains everything about the sections on method. Other philosophical theories and tools were deployed too. And so I'm going to just list some of them now. First, there is the quadripartite faculty psychology. For Arnaud and Nicole, developing a precedent that's found in some traditional Aristotelian logics, the four parts of their logic are based on four cognitive faculties: conceiving, judging, reasoning, and ordering. Second, there's the theory of ideas. This is central to the Port Royal logic and is at the heart of our four 18th century texts. Third, there's the use of what I call rules of epistemic hygiene that are prescribed to shore up the certainty of the constituents of the science as they are placed in the correct order. And in the Port Royal logic, these rules are lifted almost verbatim from Descartes' Reguli and Discourse on Method. Of course, the Regula hadn't been printed then, but they had a manuscript of it. And they're also lifted straight out of Pascal's The Art of Persuasion. And we'll see analogues of these in some of our 4 texts. These rules appeal to the theory of ideas that's already been mentioned, and to the theory of definitions. We won't have time to look at the theory of definitions. Fourth and finally, all these logic texts are concerned with the use of use intuitive metaphors and arguments by analogy to explain the conceptions of method that they want to use. Now, in the grid here, I've tabulated the appearance of these constituents in the discussions of method by Arnaud and Nicole. That's the first one, the Port Royal, and then our 4 18th century authors. And as we proceed, we'll see the reasons for the various ticks and crosses in the table, and also we'll get some explanation of why Condillac is an outlier. And that will be where we finish up. Okay, so that's where we're heading. I'm going to go through the 4 logic texts, and part of what will happen is that you will see where each of these features of the sections on logic come into play. Okay. Let's now look at Isaac Watts on method. Watts's logic has 4 parts corresponding to the 4 faculties of perception, judgment, reasoning, and disposition. The method pertains to disposition, that is, to the disposing or situating of propositions and arguments. So in its basic structure, Watts's logic follows the Port Royal logic, and this has been noted by many historians of philosophy before. The subtitle of Watts's logic is The Right Use of Reason. And in his introduction, he sets out just what logic does for us, how it improves the mind. He also summarizes the 4 cognitive faculties and their relation to reason that are elaborated in the 4 parts of the work. So let's examine some of his claims about the improvements that logic brings, and his summary treatment of the 4th faculty, disposition. The aim of logic, according to Watts, is not simply to attain knowledge in the sciences, but to govern both the greater and the meaner actions of life. It is the cultivation of our reason by which we are better enabled to distinguish good from evil, as well as truth from falsehood. And both these are matters of the highest importance, whether we regard this life or the life to come. This is achieved by the improvement of our reason or intellectual powers. Indeed, it is through the pursuit of truth that we become acquainted with, quoting again, we become acquainted with the nature of things. It is by this means we discover our duty to God and our fellow creatures. That is, natural religion. So Watts regards logic as having normative aims set within a Christian theological framework and not as an end in itself. Importantly, and somewhat disappointingly, Watts also thinks that the cultivation of one's intellectual powers sets one apart from other humans. And this is a rather ugly quote, which I'll give you. The acquired improvements of the power of reason in different men make a much greater distinction between them than nature had made. The improvement of reason hath raised the learned and the prudent in the European world almost as much above the Hottentots and other savages of Africa, as those savages are by nature superior to the birds, the beasts, and the fishes. Watts also regards logic as an art, as distinct from a science, and he distinguishes between natural logic, which includes the intuitive reasoning processes that all humans use, including the Hottentots, from artificial logic, or the art of logic, which is a higher advancement, as he calls it. Well, so much for the normative aims of logic. Let's turn to method. The faculty of the mind to which method pertains is disposition. Here, the meaning of disposition is to arrange or to order, put in order. It's related to the older meaning of disposal as used by Locke when he says in the second treatise that everyone has a right of disposal of themselves. Here's how Watts defines it. Disposition is that operation of the mind whereby we put the ideas, propositions, and arguments which we've formed concerning one subject into such an order as is fittest to gain the clearest knowledge of it, to retain it longest, and to explain it to others in the best manner. In short, it is the ranging of our thoughts in such order as is best for our own and others' conception and memory. And Watts claims that the description of the four operations of the mind that he's just completed, preceding this quote, is actually an example of method in action. What then is method? That's what disposition is. Method is the way we construct a science. It's not merely a clear and a distinct idea, a well-formed proposition or a just argument that is sufficient to search out and communicate the knowledge of a subject. There must be a variety and series of them disposed in a due manner in order to attain this end. Method is the way we proceed from constructing arguments using the theory of demonstration to constructing an actual science. Here's what Watts's definition of method. In logic, method is the disposition of a variety of thoughts on any subject in such order as may best serve to find out unknown truths, to explain and confirm truths that are known, or to fix them in the memory. Now, there are two kinds of method, natural and arbitrary. Natural method, in turn, is twofold, namely analysis and synthesis. So let's look then at analytic method. Analytic method takes the whole compound as it finds it and leads us into the knowledge of it by resolving it into its first principles or parts, its generic nature, and its special properties. By contrast, synthetic method begins with the parts and leads onward to the knowledge of the whole. It begins with the most simple principles and general truths and proceeds by degrees to that which is drawn from them or compounded of them. And note that in keeping with NATCA, analysis and synthesis either end with principles or begin with principles. And here is just a structure diagram for Watts's theory of method. So there are two types of logic, natural and artificial. Part of logic is method, one of the four parts. There is a natural method and an artificial method. The artificial method is then divided into analysis and synthesis. Watts goes on to make a series of observations about analysis and synthesis, and three of them are worthy of comment here. First, analysis is a method of discovery, and this is consistent with the logical tradition. Second, he stresses that in practicing the art of logic, it's often difficult to keep analysis and synthesis apart, and a mixed method is sometimes required. And third, he rightly points out that analysis can be applied to the art of logic itself. So analysis is not strictly confined to the sciences. Finally, in the second chapter on method, Watts sets out the requisites of true method, and it must be safe, plain and easy, distinct, full without defect, short, proper and connected. And in fact, you find a similar list in John Wallis's logic from the previous century. Corresponding to each requirement, there's a rule. And much could be said about this chapter, but 3 points again stand out. The first is the role of the theory of principles in the rules. For example, Rule 1 concerns the method of keeping safe and free from error, and this is how that's done. Use great care and circumspection in laying the foundations of your discourse or your scheme of thoughts upon any subject. These propositions, which are to stand as first principles and on which the whole argument depends, must be viewed on all sides with utmost accuracy, lest an error being admitted there should diffuse itself through the whole subject. We find very similar claims in, for example, Pascal's art on the art of reasoning and so on. Clearly, Watts is framing his method in terms of the neo-Aristotelian theory of knowledge acquisition. Second, by the time Watts gets to the end of his elaboration of the rules, it's clear that he has the composition of a discourse in mind. And the method is such that the outcome of its application is a spoken or written discourse on the science at hand. And thus, in his notes on Rule 5, for example, concerning making it short, he says the following: avoid needless repetitions, avoid prolixity, don't multiply examples, avoid trappings of art, sounding learned, long parenthetical comments. And finally, in his exposition of Rule 6, Watts shows that he's aware of the dangers of overplaying the Euclidean ideal. Let your method be proper to the subject. All sciences must not be learnt or taught in one method. Morality and theology, metaphysics and logic will not be easily and happily reduced to a strict mathematical method. Those who have tried have found much inconvenience therein. And I wonder whether there's a kind of implicit criticism of Spinoza there. Okay, so let's move from Watts on method to de Crousaz. His logic was first published in 1712 as a system of reflections, or a new essay on logic, and it appeared in a revised, much augmented version called the Logic or System of Reflections in 1720, and there was a good translation by a chap called John Hanley in 1724, and that's the text I'm working from, largely. The new treatise is a thorough and well-organised, this is the name of Henley's translation, new treatise. It's a thorough and well-organised logic that's true to the tradition arising from Port Royalists. Like Watts's logic, it's a strongly Christian and erudite work. It's full of classical allusions and shows a broad appreciation of the contributions of early modern philosophers such as Montaigne and Descartes, as well as the writings of Molière and Fontenelle. In addition, like Watts's logic, its conception of the human reasoner embraces the whole person. Moral and theological concerns pervade its advice and its examples. De Crousaz follows the Port Royal logic in the overall structure, and his logic contains 4 parts, each elaborating an operation of the mind. Part 4 is therefore on method, and the layout and content is just what one would expect, with a treatment of the methods of analysis and synthesis, a discussion of the theory of definitions, a discussion of the method of division, the arranging of arguments and the requirements of a written discourse, just like we've seen in Watts. And interestingly, it ends with a chapter on constructing dialogues, which de Crousaz regards as the most difficult form of discourse. There's not time to give his treatment of method its full due here, so it'll have to suffice to briefly introduce his discussion of analysis and synthesis. And this discussion is just what one would expect from a facultative logic, and that's a term that a historian of philosophy called Jim Bickerud proposed back in 1985, and I think it's a very, very helpful term for understanding these logics. It's committed to the theory of principles and to the containment theory of concepts. Method, according to de Crousaz, is the way we ought to follow for the ordering of our thoughts. It aims at, quote, brevity, fullness, and certainty. It's about arranging what we know about a subject. And when it comes to analysis and synthesis, de Crousaz's treatment is set within the neo-Aristotelian theory of knowledge acquisition. Analysis is a method of invention, and it receives the lion's share of attention in his exposition of the methods. And de Crousaz says that analysis begins with a question and rises by degrees to the discovery of the principles that solve it or answer it. As our notions ascend from certain particular objects to general maxims and propositions, the ascending from particulars to generals is likewise called analytic, and the descending from generals to the particulars, synthetic. And while he illustrates the method of analysis with geometrical examples, he goes on to claim that, quote, it may also take place in other subjects than geometry, such as, he says, the justification of man before God. So clearly he believes that the methods of analysis and synthesis, well, analysis is his major concern, is applicable in theology. Okay, that's a bit of a condensed treatment of de Cruces. It's an interesting logic from many perspectives, but I don't want to get too caught up in the details because we've still got two more to get through. Let's then turn to William Duncan on method. Like Watts and de Cruces, Duncan's The Elements of Logic is in 4 parts, and each part being an exposition of an operation of the mind. Those operations, again, being perception, judgment, reasoning, and disposition. Book 4 is entitled Of Method and comprises about 1/4 of the work. And just as an aside, it is interesting if you do a comparison, some logics, the part 4 is rather short and only a small portion of the work. This is particularly the case for the Port Royal logic. In other works, you find that method is given a much greater space or a greater proportion of the volume, and that's the case here with William Duncan. Overall, Duncan's logic is far more Lockean than that of Watts, but like Watts and de Cruces, it's committed to NATCA. It develops an account of analysis and synthesis, and it's committed to the containment theory of concepts. It's committed to the Euclidean ideal and deploys strong metaphors to explain certain features of the method. Again, like Watts's logic, Duncan's logic is concerned with human improvement. Indeed, no subject other than logic, according to Duncan, quote, is more important than that which introduces us to the knowledge of ourselves, i.e. logic. And the extent to which we improve our minds through logic is the measure of our advancement above others of our kind. No part of knowledge yields a fairer prospect of improvement than that which takes account of the understanding, examines its powers and faculties, and shows the ways by which it comes to attain its various notions of things. This is properly the design of logic. Now, Book 1 on perception presents a theory of ideas, largely derived from Locke's essay. Duncan develops the contrast between simple and complex ideas. He deals with abstract or general ideas. He deals with ideas of substance, ideas of genera and species. He presents a Lockean account of knowledge, including intuitive knowledge as the perception of the agreement or disagreement of two ideas. He gives a Lockean account of intermediate ideas. And all of this is set within a commitment to NATCA. Duncan even borrows Locke's examples, such as the corpuscular structure underlying the poisonous powers of hemlock. He does differ from Locke, however, in his view that the method of demonstration is the syllogistic, and the third section on reasoning is an exposition of the syllogistic. Perhaps the most striking feature of Duncan's logic, in comparison to those of Watts and de Cruces, is its emphasis on experimental philosophy and the distinction between natural knowledge and scientifical knowledge. The latter term a direct borrowing from Locke's essay. All of this is set within a strong commitment to NATCA, and it's worth noting his treatments of induction, analogical reasoning, and especially his discussion of Newton's approach to epistemic access to principles. In all, Duncan's logic is highly derivative with very little innovation apart from its interest in natural philosophy. So turning to Book 4 on method, we find that it contains 3 chapters. The first introduces the methods of analysis and synthesis. The second is on analysis, and the third on synthesis, which Duncan calls the method of science. His discussion of the method of science is far and away the most interesting feature of the logic, but we won't have time to explore it much here. For Duncan, method is concerned with, quote, the disposal and arrangement of our thoughts, when we endeavour so to put them together as that their mutual connection and dependence may be clearly seen. In order for method to take place, the mind must have already exercised the other faculties, perception, reasoning, and so on. and in so doing have generated some knowledge. Disposition or method is fundamentally an ordering function. He says, when therefore a man accustomed to much thinking comes after any considerable interval of time to take a survey of his own intellectual acquisitions, he seldom finds reason to be satisfied with that order and disposition according to which they made their entrance into his understanding. They are dispersed, scattered, without subordination or any just regular coherence. And thus, quote, the true and proper business of method is to ascertain the various divisions of human knowledge, and so to adjust and connect the parts in every branch that they may seem to grow out of one another and form a regular body of science, rising from first principles and proceeding by an orderly concatenation of truths. Note the commitment to the theory of principles. This becomes central to the account of the methods of analysis and synthesis. Analysis is reasoning to principles, synthesis is reasoning from principles. Carrying on the series of proofs in a reverse order until they at last terminate in first principles is what analysis is. Or beginning with these principles, we may take the contrary way and from them deduce by a direct train of reasoning all the several propositions we want to establish. That's what synthesis is. The first is the method of invention, which often involves, quote, a judicious choice of intermediate ideas, following Locke, or sagacity. He calls it sagacity just as Locke does in Book 4 of the essay. And all this is illustrated by rather laboured examples from arithmetic and algebra. More interesting by far is the discussion in Chapter 3 of synthesis, which he calls the method of science. And this presents a Lockean theory of knowledge with discussions of skepticism, testimony, and as I've already mentioned, the distinction between natural and scientifical knowledge, replete with examples lifted directly from Locke's essay. And one can almost hear Locke speaking through Duncan in passages such as this. Had we such an intimate acquaintance with the structure of both aqua regia and gold, as to be able thence to discern why the one so operates upon the other as to occasion its dissolution, insomuch that from the ideas of them in our minds we could clearly deduce that bodies of such a make applied one to another must necessarily produce the effect here mentioned, our knowledge would then be scientifical and stand upon the foundation either of intuition or demonstration, according as the perception was immediate or attained by means of intervening ideas. Then comes an important twist. Only adumbrated in Locke, right at the end of Locke's life, namely that experiments can be the basis of principles in natural philosophy, in spite of the fact that these principles lack the absolute certainty of scientifical knowledge. In mechanics, hydrostatics and pneumatics, etc., where from postulata ascertained by experience the whole theory relating to these branches of knowledge follows in a way of strict demonstration. And this I take to be the reason why many parts of natural philosophy are honoured with the name of sciences. Not that they are ultimately founded on intuition, but that the several principles peculiar to them being assumed on the foundation of experience, the theory deduced from these principles is established by scientifical reasoning. And the examples that he gives are from Newton's Principia. And it is, in effect, Newton's notion of proof by experiment. And we don't have time to go into that now, but I see that as being a really crucial development in early modern understandings of the nature of proofs. Okay, our fourth and last logic, and that is the logic of Condillac. This is a posthumous work published in the very same month that its author died. 7 years earlier, the Englishman Edward Bentham had published what's called an Introduction to Logic, written from Christchurch, where Locke had been a student. And surprisingly, though, Bentham's logic only includes 3 parts and 3 operations of the mind, and it lacks the 4th part on method. Condillac, however, might, albeit a bit superficially and anachronistically, be considered to have made up for Bentham's omission, because his logic has only one part, and it only discusses one operation of the mind. And in effect, the whole logic is about method. The logic is a very peculiar work. It was written at the request of Count Ignace Potocki of Poland, and Condillac himself describes it as, quote, simplified therein and consequently perfected. It lacks any discussion of the syllogism or any discussion of the nature and properties of propositions. What it does contain, however, is an account of the acquisition of ideas, a theory of analysis that's deeply tied to language, as we'll see, an extended treatment of definitions, the development of the mathematical analogy of reasoning, so the Euclidean ideal, and a discussion of certainty. Each of these topics can be found in the logics that we've already examined that are divided into the quadripartite structure. So Condillac's logic should not be regarded as simply an extended essay on method, even though the theory of analysis is at its core. Okay, there are at least two very interesting features of Condillac's logic that set it apart from the texts of Watts, de Crousaz, and Duncan. First, unlike those other texts, Condillac rejects the neo-Aristotelian theory of knowledge acquisition. He's opposed to the role of principles in the acquisition of knowledge. Second, Condillac's logic is not a truncated product that fails to deal with central topics in logical theory, because given Condillac's conception of analysis, there is no role for many of the traditional features of logic texts, especially the syllogistic. The philosophical core of Condillac's views on logic is his language-based theory of analysis. And I'm going to touch on this theory here. However, my main focus is on Condillac's rejection of the theory of principles and their role in the acquisition of scientific knowledge. There's a sense in which we've seen an anticipation of this in Duncan's discussion of the method of science. However, as we saw, Duncan treats proof by experiment in the context of NATCA. Condillac goes well beyond Locke and Duncan insofar as he rejects the NATCA framework altogether, in spite of adhering to a thoroughly Lockean theory of ideas and the classical theory of concepts, or containment theory of concepts. So let's turn first to Condillac on principles. Now, ironically, in doing this, we need to focus on the 1746 work, an essay on the origin of human knowledge, and not on the logique. We will also just briefly look at a 1775 work called On the Art of Thinking, rather than the logic. For without the orientation provided by these works, the nature and content of the logique is difficult to understand. So turning first to the essay on the origin of human knowledge, the whole of section 2, part 1, quite a long part, is concerned with analysis and the operations of the mind. The operations discussed are perception, consciousness, attention, memory, contemplation, and imagination. And they're treated of in terms of a Lockean theory of ideas, where the distinction between simple and complex ideas and the operations of combining and decomposing complex ideas are to the fore. In paragraph 7 of section 2, Condillac opens by claiming that the operation of abstracting, which is a form of decompounding ideas, leads to the use of general propositions. And then he provides a kind of historical reconstruction as to how general propositions came to function as principles with a foundational role in knowledge acquisition. Here's what he says. This is the essay, remember, not the logique. It's published 34 years before the logique. To demonstrate the certainty of their discoveries, the first discoveries in science, all they could do was to show that they agreed with general propositions that no one would doubt. Think inductive generalizations. That caused the belief that these propositions were the true source of our knowledge. And consequently, they were given the name principle. And it became a generally accepted prejudice, still honoured, that one should reason only according to principles. In other words, you start your reasoning from principles. Eventually, quoting again, this prejudice gave birth to innumerable systems. The futility of this approach is now evident in the method of synthesis, which is supposedly, quote, a method in which it seems that truth is not allowed to appear unless it has been preceded by a host of axioms, definitions, and other propositions. And Condillac goes on to call this the method I condemn. And he claims that general propositions are, quote, only the result of our knowledge of particulars, and that, quote, to expound the truth with the scaffolding of the principles that the synthetic method demands, end quote, presupposes that we already know what the method delivers. And he makes similar complaints about the standard theory of analysis, quoting again, I know of nothing that is more useless than the method of analysis. Instead, true analysis is nothing but an operation that results from the composing and decomposing of our ideas to create new combinations and to discover by this means their mutual relations and the new ideas they can produce. This analysis is the true secret of discoveries. And note here that this is really predicated on the containment theory of concepts. Well, what then is the method of analysis according to Condillac? And now we turn finally to the logique. In part two of the logique, Condillac argues that language itself is the analytic method. Condillac claims, quote, we think by means of languages. As rules of our judgments, they produce our knowledge, our opinions, and our prejudices. In a word, they produce all that is good and all that is bad in our judgments. Again, quoting from the logique, the art of reasoning is reduced to a well-made language. The limits of our language, that's the end of the quote, the limits of our language are the limits of thought, according to Condillac. The confusions and errors within our language are just errors of thought. The upshot is that the real principles, in the sense of origins or archae, the real principles are our senses, and that definitions are not principles, but analyses of our ideas gained or acquired via the senses. Let us not say that we must have definitions as the principles of our researches. Let us say more simply that we must begin well, that is, we must see things as they are, see meaning perceive things as they are, and let us add that in order to see them, perceive them in this way, we must begin by making analyses, i.e., definitions. This is a truly revisionist conception of analysis and of knowledge acquisition, a conception that appears to make the notion of synthesis redundant, and a conception that really cannot be brought into conformity with the standard structure of 18th century logic texts, as we've seen. So there we have it. 4 discussions of method, all of them, I believe, best understood by appeal to the theory of principles. And I open it now for discussion. Thank you.